Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Rogers Tavern Museum Spring Lecture Series. My name is Jennifer Petz, an independent museum consultant working with the town of Perryville here at Rogers Tavern. The museum is situated on the banks of the beautiful Susquehanna River in Perryville, Maryland. We're located about 43 miles from the city of Baltimore and 34 miles from Wilmington, Delaware. The Susquehanna Lower Ferry and an ordinary was formally established by the Maryland Colonial Legislature in 1695 on both sides of the river because of its location on a major overland transportation roadway that connected eastern and southern colonial port cities and towns. The building that became known as Rogers Tavern was built sometime in the 1740s, and it provided a place for travelers to rest and to grab a bite to eat, and for locals to catch up on the news of the day, drink with their friends and family, conduct a little business on the side too. And this continued on until about the 1880s, when it ceased operation as a tavern slash hotel slash summer boarding house. It was converted into a duplex housing unit. Rogers Tavern was saved from demolition by the organization today known as Preservation Maryland in 1954. The Friends of Rogers Tavern was subsequently formed with the goal to return the building to its 18th century appearance. It was placed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1972 and was purchased by the town of Perryville in 1993. The mission of the Rogers Tavern Museum is to preserve and share the inimitable stories of all those who lived, worked at, and visited this once vital link along an important roadway in America's early history, through engaging dynamic experiences that encourage exploration of our region's cultural and natural heritage. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. John Osborne. I have to forgive the whole left and right. I have not learned stage left tonight. He is a emeritus professor of history from Dickinson College in Carlisle, PA, from which he retired after devoting more than 30 years of teaching. With him is Christine Bombaro, head librarian at the University of Massachusetts Global, and former associate director of the Wagner Sparr Library at Dickinson College. Together, they worked with history students at Dickinson for 19 years, helping them learn to research lesser known but notable figures such as John A.J. Creswell.
Thank you for the invitation. It's wonderful to be here. There's a remarkable setting. Creswell, we haven't, neither Chris or I have dealt with Creswell for a couple of years, and it's so wonderful to have him back in our lives. I was reading our book and looked at it and thought, oh, this is not bad. We did a fairly good job with this. I don't know how much you know about John Andrew Jackson Creswell from Maryland, but I'm going to run down just a simple biography to give you an idea of who he was. He's a local boy. He's a Cecil County, hometown hero. He attended West Nottingham School, and he attended Dickinson College. Dickinson College was a strong influence on him, as we'll see. He came back to Cecil County. He took his law degree and became one of the outstanding lawyers outside of Baltimore. In all of Maryland, certainly one of the leading attorney in Cecil County. He was, like his father, a Democrat to begin with, although he flirted with the Whig Party, being a businessman. And when the national crisis came in 1860, he had a very tough time figuring out, like most Marylanders did, what to do with the succession crisis. He decided on the Union and became a very, very influential figure in the Unionist cause in Maryland. He was recognized very quickly by those who supported the Unionists in Maryland. Became a confidant of Abraham Lincoln, who depended upon him to moderate the massive arguments going on all sides during the first 2 or 3 years of the Civil War. He went to Congress. He served in Congress at a crucial time, the time of the 13th Amendment. He had a very, very powerful role in that. He lost re-election and then was appointed senator from Maryland, dealing with the 14th Amendment. He became, when Ulysses Grant became president, he was touted as a possible vice president for Grant, but in the end took the post of Postmaster General and became one of the most influential Postmaster Generals in the history of the United States Post Office. He, following his resignation there, he was asked to work again for the federal government as an adjudicator for the Alabama claims. The Confederate raider Alabama, built in the United Kingdom, occasioned the British to give reparations for the damage that the Alabama had caused to American shipping. And he was responsible for adjudicating the claims and then dishing out the cash that the British had given for this purpose. So a long, remarkable career. On paper, yes, but like many others of his standing, he is remembered, but remembered in very, very strange and varied ways, because he is in many ways an unknown figure. And when we began to investigate this seemingly marvelous government career, we started to ask very, very strong questions. We couldn't get the answers straight away because he was not that documented as we historians would say. He had no children, and usually at this time in the later 19th century, if you wanted to be remembered, you just had a devoted daughter or a devoted son get all your diaries together and write these wonderful privately published biographies of you. This never happened with Creswell. I think I'll have Chris say how we went about bringing, in that wonderful phrase, bringing him down out of the attic of history. And then after this, I will talk again in more specifics about the story that's behind this sort of potted biography that I've just given.
So, as you heard in our introduction, John and I worked together for a long time at Dickinson College. he taught a course on historical methodology, which I was attached to for many years as a history major myself. John is always a hands-on teacher, and this was kind of early in my career. And John said his idea for this class was to have the students research a lesser-known figure in Dickinson's history. Now, I should add that Dickinson College has been around for a long time, since 1783 or 1773, depending on who and when you ask that question. That's a story. But we claim some notable individuals such as James Buchanan, I'm sure you've heard of him, and who is credited for careening us into civil war, and also his rather infamous Supreme Court Justice Roger Taney, who decided the Dred Scott decision, decided basically that African Americans were not people to be counted. So they're among our ranks at Dickinson. But we have a few others, semi-famous that you may or may not have heard of. We have very robust archives at Dickinson College. And so John had pulled some names out that he wanted students to research. This was at an early-ish point in my career, and I was a little intimidated by this because databases weren't as robust as they are now. They certainly weren't free. And I wasn't sure how I was going to go about this in a 16-week period with 15 students, getting them to write a viable essay. So I said to John, can you give me somebody that I can, make an example out of? And he hands me this name, John A.J. Creswell. And so I started digging into it. And I found all of the little biographical tidbits that John just told you about. He was a senator, he was a congressman, he was a lawyer. He was pretty well known in his town. He had some dealings with Abraham Lincoln, which I wasn't entirely sure of at the time. And I was starting to, get materials from some of the newspaper databases that managed to cover non-national newspapers. And so I thought, I can do this. I can pull this together. I can have the students sort of follow along what I'm doing and kind of teach them the method that I went through, and they should be great. But as I was poking along, this happened. We've been referring to this gentleman as John Andrew Jackson Creswell, or AJ, but, sorry, John. And as I was researching, I started seeing this. I'm like, what is that? And I had to verify to make sure that that was the same guy. Birth dates were right. The basic details were right. Seemed to be my guy. All the biography was correct. But I thought, where did that come from? That's not right. So what was happening was when I was on kind of historical biographies, I was seeing this weird Angel James, and I thought, that happened. Now, you'll notice that after a lot of research, I also found what you're seeing up here is one of the, you can barely see it, and I apologize for that, is one of the matriculation records for Dickinson College where he had to physically sign himself in. You might not be able to read it, but it says John Andrew Jackson Creswell. This is a letter that that Ulysses Grant wrote. That the date on that was actually 1873. John Andrew Jackson Creswell. This was his graduation list at Dickinson College, 1848, John Andrew Jackson Creswell. So this was not an important detail, but it bugged me as a librarian, and I appreciate accuracy in my research. By the way, we also found the family Bible in Pennsylvania, of all places, where he was born, John Andrew Jackson Creswell, in 1828. So as I started to look through the archives at Dickinson College, I saw that a student had written an essay in the 80s hypothesizing that John A.J. Creswell changed his name because he did not want to be associated with the other Andrew Jackson, which I thought was flimsy reasoning, because there was really no evidence for that. And we also, between John and I, figured out that this may have happened when somehow when his papers got, what was left of them got transferred to the Library of Congress. And as a side note, I had a very extended conversation with a librarian at the Library of Congress who acknowledges that I'm correct, but still refuses to change it in the records. So at the same time, I'm still angry about that. At the same time, John and some of his colleagues were teaching this research methodology course every semester. And I was basically kind of having to teach the same thing every semester to 15 students over and over again. And I got tired of doing that. So I thought, wouldn't it be great if I could hand the students a guide for this, for how to do this? And I could not find one, so I wrote one. Not that quickly, but I wrote one. And this was it. It was published in 2012. But while I was writing this, it's not the most exciting kind of textbook to read. I thought, wouldn't it be great if I had proof that my methods work, that my advice as a librarian is sound. And so I hired a student at Dickinson College. I got a grant to hire him as my intern. He was not a history major, but he was very bright and eager to learn. And what I asked him to do was put together a case study, which is the last chapter of this book, basically putting the methods that I wrote about to use. And I said, let's use Creswell. And so that's when we started, and John came with us sometime. We started making some of our trips. We came down here to Cecil County, to the Historical Society. We went to the Library of Congress. We went to the National Archives. Actually went up to Boston for other reasons, but and what I set John, my student, to do was to, let's see if we can figure out, where this Angel James thing came from. But that's not what happened. What happened was we uncovered all of this other information about Creswell, which John will tell you more about in a better story than I can. And so the essay that my student wrote was largely focused on his research methodology, and he's the one that helped us dig out a lot of the material that eventually made its way into Forgotten Abolitionist, which was commissioned for, so there was a professor of Civil War at Dickinson College. His name is Matt Pinsker, who runs a Civil War database that John and I both worked on. And so as his idea was to put together a biography series, and the first in that series was the Forgotten Abolitionist book, which is where John and I put the story of Creswell together. So that begs the question that John's going to answer for you, which is kind of, first of all, where did Creswell go? Why did all this happen? All of the material that we found, even through all of that research, was really pretty spotty. And John, being the historian between us, kind of had to weave it together using other people. And this was I saying, and how did he get to this point where for one moment in history, he was probably the most famous person in the United States because he was on the floor of Congress advocating for the abolition of slavery in the 13th Amendment. So John is going to pick up from here.
Thank you. I mean, Chris's research is quite modest in her account, as you could imagine. What she and her intern produced was a series of questions about this potted biography I gave you at the beginning. Is just that. There is behind everyone a story. And this was what we approached when we started to write the full biography. We had the who, we had the what, we had the when, we had the where, as you do with a potted biography, but we didn't have the why and we didn't have the how. How did property, conservative, Southerner, born a Democrat, named after a Democrat, a man who nominated the Democratic president from his alma mater, James Buchanan, at the Democratic Convention in '56. How did he become the most famous, as Chris suggested, the most famous abolitionist in America, at least for one day, at least for a little while, and I'll explain that. It became, for us, the central theme of his story. Because when it emerged, what further emerged, the question grew even stronger and deeper. He never, and the problem for us was that he never explained himself explicitly. He never wrote a diary that we know of. He never corresponded in an extended way with one or two people explaining where he was. He never explained himself explicitly. So we had to follow the clues ourselves. We had to look and find and act as detectives to see what would explain why this young Southerner became Unionist and became one of the most famous abolitionists in history, and then why was he not remembered, as many others are, for this particular part of his life. To explain the how, we can look at three things. We all are shaped by where we come from, where we're born, where we grow up, our geography. What is his geography? We're all shaped with influences that we find in our young lives. What makes the influences of Creswell lead him where it went? And thirdly, we are all shaped by happenings in our life, with events that happen, where we must take a stand, or we must fight, run away, decide, make decisions. So we started to look at these and see that he is, I can talk a little bit about Cecil County, though I feel like I'm bringing coals to Newcastle a little bit with you all. Cecil County, a border county in a border state. Creswell had deep roots here, of course. Cecil County, closer to Lancaster than it is to Baltimore, just about, and closer to Philadelphia than it is to Annapolis. There were about 24,000 people in Cecil County in 1860. About 16,000 of them were African Americans. There was not a strong slaveholding tradition in Cecil County. I think largely because the contrast between the fluidity of business and transport and being an entrepreneur, especially in the northern districts of the county, were important in this. This was an important lesson for Creswell. The contrast between the fluidity of transport and business compared to more stable economies like farming that required or could employ more enslaved people All the way through his later life, this influence of the county that he grew up with played a role in how he decided and how he thought about slavery and how he came to the decision that slavery had to end and it had to end now. So, where he's from. Then the influences. We can't get ourselves into the mind of 8, 9, 10 teenagers, but we can observe as historians that he had a Quaker mother from a very influential Pennsylvania Quaker family. One of the female antecedents of his mother in the family was a very powerful Quaker teacher in Pennsylvania. Then, as I said, he went to West Nottingham School, ran through it in the potted biography. West Nottingham School, although it's in Cecil County, still here, was heavily influenced by Philadelphia elites rather than Southern elites. It had two alumni who signed the Constitution of the United States, including Benjamin Rush, who was probably the most anti-slavery founder, signer of the Constitution. Then he went to Dickinson College, again, above the Mason-Dixon line, a college that was in 1848, 1846, and 1847, when he attended, all the way down into 1860, was a very interesting mix. It was a college divider. And for example, his class had, I think, 30 students, and 16 of them were from the South, most of them from Maryland, and then from Virginia, and 14 students from the North. And it was Methodist at the time, and the Methodist Church was also struggling with the idea of where it stood on slavery and was about to split wide open into Southern Methodists and into Northern Methodists. So things were going on. And then in 1848, while he was in his penultimate year at Dickinson, there was an incident in the college, or in the town, not in the college, in the town, in which freedom seekers from Maryland who had escaped up into Carlisle were being forced to be returned under the Fugitive Slave Act to their owners who had come to Carlisle to collect them. Free blacks in Carlisle didn't like this at all. And so when the case was being judged under the Fugitive Slave Act, rescued the freedom seekers. One of them was recaptured, and in the struggle, one of the slave holders who had come to retrieve his property was badly injured and subsequently died. This put the Dickinson and right into the middle of the sectional crisis. The Southerners, as can be described, the Southerners, all of Creswell's companions and so on, immediately started packing up, and they were going to leave. The professor who had been accused of starting the riot, which of course he didn't, came to see them, persuaded them that there were ways in which one could differ and not have a riot, and convinced the Southern students that this was a problem, but was a problem that could be worked out with moderation. The students unpacked. McClintock went on trial for instigating the riot. He was acquitted. And at the same time, Creswell took part in his first political act, which was a letter that he and his fellow Southerners formulated and circulated in Southern newspapers all through the South, Virginia, Maryland, and so on, explaining that Dickinson College and McClintock had nothing to do with the riot. It wasn't their problem, and that the accusations and the fantastic conspiracy theories being spread around the South were just that. And the Southerners were able to maintain their interest in the college, and so on, and save the college really from losing half of its student body and possible students. So the influences of his schooling obviously had a role to play, but it's events that really start to put him together as a player in this great question. The history of Maryland, of course, from 1860 and the couple of years that followed, is remarkably complicated. That was one of the most difficult, coming from the outside, as I did as an historian. Happily, a lot of the work that I did involved secondary sources rather than the primary sources Chris was talking about. It was the most difficult to lay out Creswell's role within it, because at the election of 1860, and as secession started to grip in the Deep South, Maryland was another house divided, really. The Union couldn't afford to have Maryland join the Confederacy, couldn't afford to have Virginia join the Confederacy. It lost out with Virginia, but it was able to barely keep Maryland in the Union. This argument laid open the decisions that had to be made. Whenever we argue using, whenever we debate, whenever we think about possibilities, whenever we hypothesize, it's easy for us to do this. When the event arrives and you've got to make your stand, then it becomes difficult. And this is what was happening in Maryland at the time, and it was happening in Cecil County, and it was happening to Creswell as well. Also his other young, privileged white Southerners. Creswell's, we found to be conservative. He was never radical in the sense of being a firebrand. To him, at the very beginning of this crisis, Maryland on a knife edge, he wanted caution, compromise, and above all, he wanted federal respect for Maryland's independence. This brought him close to being in real trouble with federal officials. But finally, he saw, with his kind of natural pragmatism and his conservatism, that moderation was preferable, but moderation was soon to be taken over by events. He could see this. And so finally, after a lot of trouble thinking amongst he and his friends, he decided on the Union. Many, as you know, many Marylanders didn't decide on the Union. And the 1st Maryland Infantry fought the 1st Maryland Infantry on the slopes of Postal and Gettysburg. Brother, literally, killing brother. Unionism, however, was the decision that Creswell made. Events drove him along. And his reaction to these events was that he never ever forgave Southern slaveholding power for ruining the chance at moderation, for not allowing peace conferences to take place, for precipitously firing on Fort Sumter and making war on the Union. At the same time, of course, the Union was beginning to make war on the South. But he never forgave Southern slaveholding for the carnage that they had inflicted upon the nation. Still, this is not all of the story. You can be a unionist and you can be a slaveholder. You can be a unionist and support moderation, support particular ways of dealing with the question, short of outright abolition. What drove him then onto the center of these events to stand up in the Congress, House of Representatives, and say that slavery should end with no ties, no compensation? What brought him there? A true abolitionist, not someone who wanted to send blacks to Liberia, not someone who wanted to slowly do away with slavery, not someone who even wanted to pay slave owners the value of their profit, but someone who just said that slavery must end, and it must end now. I think that as he made his stand, two things were happening. One, it became clear to us that here was a man who had really done well at Dickinson. He was the valedictorian. What he had learned was how intelligent he was, how efficient he was, and how he could get things done. And he started to show that he could get things done. He became one of the Maryland's primary recruiters of Union troops. He became an adjutant general for Maryland, and he did a remarkable job putting Marylanders, every Marylander that went into Union blue meant that Maryland would stay in the Union. Many of his friends went into Confederate gray, but every time that he recruited Marylanders into Union blue, he was helping to keep Maryland in the Union and save the Union, perhaps. He started to be seen as efficient. He started to be seen and he started to be valued for his moderation, for his determination, his efficiency. And that slowly brought him into contact with other people of like mind. And I think whenever we are have to make a stand on a decision, events provide opponents, of course, but events provide allies and friends and comrades. And he came into being recognized. He came to be recognized as impressive by many who also thought that slavery should have its end. Thaddeus Stevens of Lancaster, William Kelly of Philadelphia, Henry Winter Davis, rabid abolitionist, Edwin Webster, who he went to Dickinson with. All of this encouragement brought what I call a kind of courage, a collective courage. Your feelings are reinforced by like-minded people, and they grow and they become more vocal. This courage of companionship, comradeship, is clearly stated in a speech that Creswell gave during the congressional election of 1863. You can read it there yourself. That he used to be under this rod of iron, and that we were too frightened to stand against this power. Slavery was not a question of political economy, it was a question of political power. And we all, cowards as we were, shrank before it. He was convinced that what he called white liberation, he was convinced of white liberation, that the white Marylander had been liberated by the events of the conflict, that there was now enough collective strength for men and women to stand up and say that slavery should end in Maryland for all kinds of reasons, but not the least for economic reasons. So this white that you'll see, we have his speeches where he speaks to us, and these kind of insights come through in these speeches over and over again. In his historic speech, he is famous for one day in America as the most famous abolitionist, which is a kind of a strange situation for a young, privileged Marylander to be in. He had just overseen the new Maryland Constitution, which ended slavery and had been voted by Marylanders into law, thereby abolishing slavery in Maryland. This encouraged his friends to ask him to stand up and open the debate on the 13th Amendment, which was to end slavery. I don't know if you've seen the Steven Spielberg movie, the Lincoln movie, that tells a lot of the story of there. Now, you know, we always complain that that Creswell should have been in the movie since he opened the debate. But they needed Abraham Lincoln to be in the center of the movie, of course. His famous speech sums up a lot of what we've been talking about. He tells the story again of white liberation, how we were cowed by the South threatening civil war if we didn't do as they asked and let them maintain slavery. He talks about also, above all, he talks about that economic argument that I talked about at the beginning with Cecil County. He said that slavery, often the argument for slavery was that it created wealth. It made king cotton. It made the United States economy one of the strongest in the world. He rubbished this completely in this. He said that free labor, like he saw in Cecil County, free labor will always trump bondage labor. The way in which you make money, the way in which you move money, the way in which you create wealth is bound up in free labor, not in bondage labor. He said that far from making Maryland wealthy, the slavery had held back Maryland. And even in the few months during which slavery was now illegal in Maryland, they had been able to see how the economy was improving and how things were moving along, facing forward, is how he put it. He always seemed to look forward. Now, as historians, we always have to look at the other side. This illustration from Harper's Weekly, by the way, you can't really make out anyone else except for this gent here with the beard, perhaps. The artist obviously was outlining the people that he thought were the most important in this Congress that had just passed the 13th Amendment. Those three, Thaddeus Stevens on the left, William Kelly of Philadelphia, the tall chap behind them, and then embracing Thaddeus Stevens, John Andrew Jackson Creswell. Clearly a very, very important figure. But Creswell went back to Maryland. And we have to address the claims against Creswell. And we have to ask the question, was he the opportunistic weather vane that the Democrats accused him of being? Were events acting on him, or was he acting on events? He certainly enjoyed the limelight. Lincoln depended upon him to keep Maryland, fractured Maryland, both in the Union, but he also depended upon him to keep the Unionists from tearing each other up and causing problems for unionism in Maryland. He met with Lincoln on the morning of Lincoln's assassination in the White House, in the Oval Office. He gave him a list of people who he had nominated from Maryland who wanted federal positions. And he took the opportunity to ask the president if he would pardon one of his friends who had just returned from being a Confederate officer. Lincoln accepted the one list, refused to pardon the friend of Creswell, but the meeting ended with, as somebody related, I forget who it was, a friendly chat about memories. Of course, just a matter of hours later, John Wilkes Booth shot Abraham Lincoln, and everything changed. It changed for Creswell too, and it changed for Maryland too. Maryland had been powerfully Unionist, with the help of the Union Army, of course, and people like Creswell and Thomas Hicks, the governor, and Bradford, the governor, and so on. But the Democratic Party had never, ever lost its power. Gene Baker, who is probably one of the best historians of politics in Maryland at this time, said that democracy the Democratic Party never really lost its grip. It just lost it for just that little moment. But then the moment that the shooting stopped, then the Democratic Party regained its power. Now, not as a slave owning party, but a party that was deep in the traditions of the state. That meant that unionism was doomed in Maryland, and it meant that Creswell eventually would lose his Senate seat and lose a lot of the influence that he had in Maryland. Of course, his career wasn't over. He was one of the leading postmaster generals in the history of the office. When we asked the question, was he just an opportunistic? Was he just opportunistic and took advantage of being of his ambitions and being a unionist? We can look at his work as Postmaster General, because he stood by his values. He certainly proved that his values on both moral and economic values concerning slavery were genuine. I don't know how many of you know, but before the Civil War, a black person, an African American, was not allowed to touch the United States mail, because the Southern power in Congress were afraid that the mails, going from state to state as they did, would be used by abolitionists from the North to raise free blacks in the South, or enslaved blacks in the South, to mutiny against their condition. And so they weren't ever even allowed to touch the mail. Well, Montgomery Blair, his predecessor, also of Maryland, and John Creswell, they changed that completely. And soon there were postmasters of various races, and there were letter carriers of African-American letter carriers throughout the United States. So, I know this has gone on, but I think that we can make a judgment. Perhaps I can make a judgment. You may make a judgment that tells the story that the way he grew up, what influenced him, and the events, of course, that overtook him, made it possible for this remarkable man, really, who should be remembered much more than he is, but isn't for various reasons. I look at that historical marker at the very beginning, doesn't mention anything about abolition, doesn't mention anything about the Maryland Constitution that was passed. Obviously, democratic power had played a role in even the Historical Society way of whitewashing what he was, reducing him back to the sort of potted biography that we began with. He contributed, of course. I think that he was a remarkable, efficient, and ambitious, yes. Conservative, yes. Pragmatic, yes. But I see him as the go-to guy for 3 presidents who gave him jobs which were difficult, and he performed them with skill. And I think he's a remarkable example of growth, change, a remarkable representative of what Cecil County went through, what Maryland went through, and what the United States went through.
That's just some more reading if you're interested, if you haven't already. The book that John and I wrote, of which there are maybe 3 print copies in existence, but it was a born online book, and you can, if you just look up Forgotten Abolitionist on a site called Smashwords, you will find it. It is free. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, that was on purpose. There's more on the House Divided project at Dickinson College that we talked about, which is little on Creswell, but big on Civil War from both sides of the country. And then one of the only other published works on Creswell was published in 1969. It was an article focusing on his work in the post office.
And why? Because the post office has records.
Has records. Yeah, we weren't, and it's exhaustive, that article, as short as it is. But that's the only other published secondary work exclusively on
It's good work. So,
it's a little dry, but
so you may ask, what's the connection with the tavern? Well, his wife, also of Cecil County, who is reputed to have been one of the most beautiful women in Washington while he was in the Postmaster General, and gave the best parties in DC. So she was the, so that's the connection. Now, I know that I probably talked a lot. I know I've talked a lot, but I've talked a lot about things that maybe you might not have detail about. And I would recommend, if you are interested, I'll answer some questions now, but I would recommend that you go to the book. I reread it. I reread it since in 2012, yeah. So I reread it, and I thought to myself, "Ooh, this is not bad." I think. I wouldn't say that if I'd have said, "Oh, this is horrible."
It's good, I bet.
thank you.
So there's a lot of detail about Maryland, a lot of detail about Dickinson, a lot of detail about other aspects that we couldn't get to, obviously, in this kind of setting. But if you have any questions that come up.
I don't have a question actually, but I do want to remark about the slavery thing. I've been researching Fair Hill, the area of Fair Hill for 10, 12 years now. That was primarily a Scots-Irish settlement. And then, of course, the Nottingham lots all across the top of the county were Quaker. So I got interested in the slavery, how much slavery there was in the north part of the county, and compared to the south, which is the larger farming plantations, and there were almost no slaves.
Yeah.
By
I think,
local people, partly because of the Quakers, but also the Scots-Irish had smaller areas and they had many children, so that took care of a lot of the labor problem.
yeah,
But the people who did have large number of slaves at the early censuses were the industrial owners, the iron workers. I mean, a lot of iron works around here. They had 20 to 50 slaves, and the property next to the Creswell farm, it's Mount Airy, overlooking, it's where the Donaldson Brown Center is up there, overlooking. Philip Thomas owned that land and his sons, and they.
another Dickinson graduate.
Yeah, well, they had 50. He owned 50 slaves in 1790. His sons, I mean, they had like 100 and some slaves together, and there was no farming need for that. So I was wondering, were they dealing in slaves? Were they using their slaves for digging the canal, which was taking place? So that was really a startling number of slaves owned by that people right there next to Creswell.
I think you'll find that, I mean, we looked at obviously 1860, and it's true in the northern tier of the county, Cecil, there was not, I think there was 4% of the 24,000 people in Cecil County were enslaved. When you get to the southern end of the county, they outnumber the enslaved in the northern part of the county by 4 to 1.
Also, early on, they outnumbered
Yeah.
the white residents in the south.
And I think I think what happened, and this played into the point that I made that we saw with Creswell, was that free labor in manufacturing sort of slowly took over from slavery. I think people, and by 1860, manufacturing was mostly free blacks or free labor. You could see this in Baltimore, where there were, I forget what the figure was, something like 10 to 1 free blacks instead working in factories as opposed to slaves working in factories and manufacturing and business in Baltimore. I think what happened was that free labor was slowly taking over from slavery, and explained a lot of how historians observed that slavery was dying. Certainly it was dying in Maryland and it was dying in Northern Virginia. And I think that the idea that people had was that free labor was easier to manage, that business and manufacturing was more fluid, and that you could work much better with free labor. And I think that if free labor was overcoming slavery, and the figures that you found maybe are an important piece of evidence, because there's not that number of people in by 1860 already. The number of people.
Early figures. I mean, really.
The other fact is that there was an area where slavery was booming, and that was in the cotton states. The lower the growth of plantations in Mississippi and Georgia and Louisiana and so on, made the demand for slaves, which couldn't be imported by law into the United States, very powerful. And many people in the North, especially in Virginia and Maryland, were taking advantage by selling their slaves down the river. That's where the phrase comes from. When you get sold down the river, you're being sold as a slave to work the cotton plantations down the Mississippi. And I think that made the effect of the outbreak of the Civil War very, very complicated and very, very interesting in those border states, Missouri, Virginia, Western Virginia, Maryland, and so on, as well as even as far south as Tennessee. Questions of the border states were complicated by what was happening with the economy.
I have a question about his early life. Where was Creswell actually born? Where was he living when he went to Nottingham?
Or deposit.
I have all the answers. Just know it all. He was born in the house that is still in Port Deposit, right down there, the
Right.
Creswell house. But his family owned the farm up on the hill, Anchor and Hope. And so that house had just been built, I think, when his parents got married in 1822. He was born, he was the third child, and his father died a few years after he was born. So his mother lived in that house. His mother and family lived in that house until the last family member to own it was a daughter of a daughter, and she sold it in 1927, I think, to Dr. Richards.
Why didn't she write
So
why didn't she find any diaries?
I don't know. I mean, the women got a lot of coverage in the news. I mean, their social activities and all that kind of stuff. The women ruled the roost. John Creswell grew up. His grandfather had married a much older widow who had inherited the ferry business, and he got his money from the old wife. And he had an illegitimate son with another woman who he married after his first. So in other words, Andrew Jackson's father was an illegitimate child, and he only became legitimized after the old lady died.
That we didn't know.
I know.
They keep secrets.
And the way I found out was through land records and through lawsuits, because John Jr. owned land Colonel John owned land in Baltimore that his son was to inherit after he was legitimized. And there was still a lawsuit going on in the 1840s, I think, about whether that property actually should go to the grandson, go to the son. So all these court records are, explaining that this boy is actually a legitimate heir, even though he was not born legitimate.
No wonder he became a lawyer.
So,
Saved his family a lot of money.
but the women ran that whole family. Andrew Jackson's father died when he was a boy, and the mother, Rebecca Webb, was the boss of the family all the way from 1830 to her death. And she ruled Port Deposit. They owned half the land there, property there. And I think John, her son, was a convenient lawyer, but he didn't get a whole lot to say. It's the boss.
Who were involved in that coming up? Was that like a sheriff from Maryland, or they have slave catchers, or what?
Yeah, there were three what are now called freedom seekers, family, father, a mother, and a young female child, I think. And they had run away, and it was their actual owner who they'd been, I don't know who arrested them in Carlisle, but they were being held in Carlisle. It was informed, their owners were informed, their owner, and he brought a friend with him, the company, and came up to Carlisle to argue under the Fugitive Slave Act that he could just pick up his property and take it back to, which under the Fugitive Slave Act, the judge and the officials in Cumberland County, Pennsylvania, were obligated to do. But we know there were a lot of slave catchers in Pennsylvania. Gap Gang being one of the most famous. But in this case, it's unknown how they were captured. But he came up to do it himself. When the free blacks in Carlisle found out about this, of course, when he was taking out his property on the steps of the courthouse, they mobbed, spirited the family away, the wife and the child. The man was captured by the sheriff of Carlisle, and in the melee, in the middle of the street, Kennedy, what was his name? I think got knocked over and broke his leg, broke his finger, and got a fever and died. So it became immediately a huge.
And didn't the McClintock show up because something else had passed recently? Just remember.
We try to remember stuff that we did a while ago. Figure, what did we have for breakfast?
That sort of parallels the Christiana riots. And,
Yeah, the Christiana was another.
Yeah, there was a new Pennsylvania state law, that's what I remember, that prohibited them from assisting.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting.
That's how McClintock comes along.
It's kind of interesting that the federal government was behind the South. There's often the claim that the South seceded based upon their rights, their states' rights. But the argument before, during this period, early before the war, was that the states' right argument was on Pennsylvania's side. That the federal government was forcing the states to send back escaped freedom seekers. In other words, they were usurping states' rights, and states like New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey were passing laws saying that they didn't have to put up with being told what to do by the federal government. And it's the other way around.
Oh, yeah.
When they start to explain the Civil War, and when you get the South defending itself, saying we were just defending ourselves from the federal government, but it was the other way around for most of the period. The Fugitive Slave Act, the earliest one, was soon after the Constitution. Then there was one in 1850 that was made draconian. You could be, if you were walking down the street in Carlisle and someone was chasing an escaped slave down the street, and that guy said to you, the chaser said, stop him, he's an escaped slave. If you didn't stop him, you could be charged with treason against the federal government for not.
It was hanging. It was a hanging.
Yeah. For not assisting in the enforcement of the the federal Fugitive Slave Act, and that happened in Christiana because there were several people who refused to help the sheriff recapture escaped freedom seekers, and they were put on trial for treason in Pennsylvania by a federal court. They were acquitted because the federal court had Pennsylvania jurors, and you couldn't for the life of them have convicted them on that. But they were just standing watching the melee, and they got arrested and charged with treason.
Have you read about the Parker sisters out of Fremont? When they were taken by slave catchers, taken down to Baltimore. The one was detained for one girl, I think, was there for a year.
Yeah.
It was quite a story. It's a good couple books in it.
I mean, Carlisle was pretty friendly towards the Fugitive Slave Act. Democrats controlled the judgeships. They were the district attorney. And when McClintock was acquitted, the judge threw a big hissy fit, saying that, if he could, he'd overturn this and declare him guilty, et cetera, and so he took it out on the African-American rioters and sent them off to Philadelphia to prison for 3 years.
Well, this has been absolutely fascinating, and I really wish that we could keep going, but unfortunately, we have about 10 minutes left before Zoom is going to kick us out and end the program. I just wanted to remind everyone that we have another lecture coming up. On the 1st of April, we will be discussing, I will have the privilege, or maybe depends on your point of view, of discussing the non-invasive survey results at Rogers Tavern Museum grounds and the Susquehanna Water Ferry. I'm really looking forward to that as well. Again, lecture is free. You can register at rogerstavern.com/events. And I really want to thank everyone for coming tonight. You can feel kind of the ghost spirits pass all of the politics and everything that was going on in Maryland would have been discussed in spaces just like this.
Think about
Thank you so much.
Think about all the people that are still in the attic.
Thank you so much.